Okay, everyone. I think we're gonna start. We had a little bit of a late start time, so welcome back. I think everyone, from what I hear, had very stimulating experiences and breakouts and lots, good time for conversations. So I hope you've brought that back with you, and I know I'm very much looking forward to this panel on restorative justice. So I'm really honored to have Fania Davis, Jonathan Shara, and Andy Arts here to speak with us today. And just to give you a little introduction, Fania is a longtime friend of PISLAP. We've met her back in the early 2000s when she attended a national retreat at Sleeping Lady up in the Seattle, Washington area, which is our first national gathering. And Fania has done outstanding work in Oakland on behalf of young people who are learning conflict resolution skills, and she really brings a lot of courage, intelligence, and passion to her work, which is really starting to become known on the national stage. So really glad to have Fania here, and thanks to her for coming in for the West Coast. Jonathan has been connected to PISLAP for about 3 years. Is that right, Jonathan? Something like that. And we met Jonathan through his mentorship by our longtime PISLAP friend David Lerman, who I mentioned earlier this morning was one of the first prosecutors, if not the first, ever to have been funded by the state legislature, to do restorative justice and circle work in communities. And David worked in Milwaukee. And Jonathan brings a really effervescent love of his work and his mission really to every encounter I know I've had with him and we as a community have had. So welcome, Jonathan. And Andy, I've had the honor to work with Andy and actually be his supervisor when he was at Legal Services for New York City in the Bronx. And Andy really worked brilliantly with young people and their parents and treated everyone he met with dignity, with intelligence, and with great attention. So I was really thrilled when he agreed to present on this panel. We no longer work together in that capacity, but I think our comradeship and work together will continue in other forms. So I'll turn it over to you three.
Hello, everyone. This is a call and response culture, right? Thank you. Actually, I'd like to open with an African greeting, and some of you have probably heard me do this before. It's a sawubona, sawubona. And that's really, if you're talking to an individual, the plural would be sanibonani, sawubona, sanibonani. And that means, this is what the Zulu people do, and others in South Africa from other tribal groups, when they see one another, when they meet one another. They don't say, hello, what's up, how you doing? But sanibonani, sawubona. It means I see you. I see your spirit. I see your gifts. I see who you truly are. I see your goodness. And we in Oakland doing this restorative justice work do that a lot. That's really the core and the essence of our work in Oakland, our restorative justice work with youth in Oakland. No matter that you're cursing me out right now, no matter that you're throwing furniture, all down the hall, I see you. And we continue to see that young person until they begin to see themselves, see who they truly are, and transformation occurs. So I want to say, I see all of you, and I acknowledge all of you for who you are, for the work that you do in the world to create a more compassionate reality, a more just reality, a more caring reality. I see you and honor you for really creatively trying to find ways of being in the world that bring about healing and wholeness instead of division and discord and devastation. I think that is the highest work that we can do today. I think history is asking us to become healers. Because if we don't, all of us, not just the acupuncturists and the body workers and the physicians, but all of us are being asked by history to become healers. If we don't, we have no future. So this restorative justice work is healing justice work. That's really what we do. And before going on, I also want to honor the ancestors of this land. I don't know exactly what native tribe that would be. Does anyone know? Huh? Lenape. Any others? Algonquin, Oneida. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. So I just want to honor the ancestors of this land and acknowledge this is an occupied land. This is a colonized land that we stand on. And I also want to honor the ancestors in that African burial ceremony, that African burial ground, rather. I haven't been there. Has anyone in the room been there yet? Wonderful. That's great. I really plan to go before I leave this time. So kind of in alignment with what Doug has said, we've been doing a lot of talking, and I want to show you a video. I hadn't planned to do this, but I'd like to show you a video so you will have an experience of what this restorative justice work is, of what it's like to be in a circle. But before doing that, I just want to briefly, can you still hear me? Oh, I don't think it's probably not on. Before going to the video, I want to...
You can fix your other mic if you want.
I just did. Yeah. I want to just talk a little bit about my personal journey and how I came to this work of being a lawyer, this work of restorative justice. I come from Alabama during the segregation or apartheid era. We lived on Dynamite Hill. It was called that because it was a community that black people moved into that had previously been all white. We were pushing the color line. It was called Dynamite Hill because of the dynamite explosions that often went off in the neighborhood to protest our presence. I come from a place, you know about the colored water signs and the white water signs. Social messaging, you're less than, you're subhuman, you're not as intelligent, all around us. I come from a place, Birmingham, Alabama, where two of my best friends were killed in the Birmingham Sunday School bombing, September 15, 1963. And so I came out of Birmingham imbued with this fierce commitment to create a world without racial violence, a world without racial inequality, a transformed world. And so I became involved in multiple movements, the civil rights movement. I became involved in the black nationalist movement against racism. I became involved in the feminist movement against male supremacy, the socialist movement against capitalism, the internationalist movement against imperialism, the peace movement against war. I became a civil rights lawyer to fight against racism in the courtroom. And you've heard me say against, over and over again. That was my existence. And it was the existence of an enraged activist, doing, as someone said in a small group earlier, what I did more out of rage than anything else. I reached a point where I became imbalanced. And I sensed intuitively that I needed more healing energies, more feminine energies, more creative energies, so that I could come into balance after all of the hyper-rationality, hyper-masculinity, and bellicosity of being a successful trial lawyer and an activist. So I shut down my law practice. I ended up in a PhD program where I studied with healers, a Zulu healer in particular in South Africa. Came back, couldn't find a job doing this healing work. So kicking and screaming, I opened my law practice up again. I wasn't happy, but good thing I did. Because as a lawyer, Peter Gable contacted me and said, can you come to a conference? It's a PISLAP conference. We'd love to have you there. And I said, sure. And it was there at that conference where I heard the words restorative justice, where I learned about restorative justice from Ronnie Earl, then the district attorney in Travis County. Austin is a county seat. And it was an epiphany for me because this moment, hearing about restorative justice, integrated the lawyer, the healer, and the warrior in me. For the first time, I felt I could be whole. These things weren't warring against one another. So from the time that I left that retreat until today, I have been doing restorative justice. So needless to say, it was a life-altering experience for me. And I co-created Restorative Justice in 2005. And we do work not only in helping to transform youth's lives, but also in bringing about systems change. It's sort of a two-track approach, where we do healing work on personal and interpersonal levels in the schools, communities, and justice system. And we also bring about systems change within the school, shifting public policy away from punitive responses and toward more restorative responses. So right now, I'm going to show you this video. I think I'll ask Ryan to do that. And if someone could get the lights. This is just an example of a circle, a real-time circle. Is that after the new worship? Okay. So it's one of the three basic models of restorative justice. It's called the peacemaker.
All eyes is on me. I was like sweating in the hands and stuff. I was always nervous. My mom and my dad was there. It made me feel like walking out the camera. It made me feel like the candle in this would be like that. It was too much attention.
Really happy to all the people here to support my man. And I'm excited about how we're going to make this transition from there to here and beyond.
First of all, I don't care about him feeling uncomfortable. I know where that feeling is coming. That feeling is coming from a place where I don't know what's going on here. And this is different. The problem is when a kid doesn't want to be in circle, it's because I don't trust you, so I can't trust that process. So we have more relationship building to do.
So here,
I like to quote, self-sufficiency is the destination, it is the everlasting journey.
this is going to be our talking piece. When you have a talking piece, you're the only one that's talking. But it gives everybody else permission to listen. So the listeners are the most important.
We made you around. So when you were a kid,
When you wanted to be,
this kid went through a lot of the same things that I went through when I was a kid. And if not me, definitely somebody that I know. It allows us to empathize when everybody has to answer those questions.
When I was a kid, I always loved working with kids. And so I found just was hard. And when I was a child, I remember my main thing was wanting me to go to college.
Yeah, actually, still now. I want to be a race car now.
as a kid, I wanted to be a preacher.
When I was a little girl, I really wanted to be a singer.
I want to make my community better.
I always wanted to be a healer. I think that I'm in the process of doing that now. I always wanted to be happy, and I am.
And when it gets to Cedric, we're all listening for what makes him like us. And let's the people in circle know that we're all pretty much the same.
We're here to welcome, support, and navigate him through this school year, and hopefully through the rest of his life. So, in this next round, we're going to agree on the things that we need in order to be able to have this conversation.
This talking piece gives everybody else permission to listen deeper. Without values, we're not listening. We're waiting on our opportunity to talk.
If there's a value that you don't agree with, go to another round, tell them really that value you're talking about. Commitment.
Respect. Always speaking the truth.
Compassion. Honesty.
Forgiveness. Empathy. It's important to be connected.
I started noticing that I wasn't here to stereotype me. I was here to help me and see what was going on in my head. So I started to loosen up a little bit.
So confidence. Last year I didn't have confidence.
I would tell you,
I always get kicked out of class for smelling like a pound of weed in class.
so I was doing bad last year.
An open heart.
So we'll talk about what do you have to give to support such a and I want you to talk directly to Cedric. I'm the person who you can come to any time of the day. I'm the person who will be your brother, who will be your uncle.
I got your back. I got stuff for you. Come and get it. Especially our kids, study keeping it real. That's their whole life. Who's real, who's not real. And they can tell better than any one of us if you're keeping it real.
And I say this in front of everybody because if I don't, I need all of these people to hold me accountable.
I'm the person that's responsibility.
I'm the person you can count on. I'm a person you can also just say, hey, I need to talk to you if you need that.
But I'm also gonna be a person that loves you to death. All right?
And I am the person who's going to ensure that you will get your high school diploma and beyond with your life.
I don't know, that touched me. That touched me, that made me feel like I can do it.
I'm going to be the person that reminds you that you can be whatever you want to be.
At first I couldn't trust them. But then they looked me dead in the eye and started telling the truth about how they really felt, what they can do. So I was like, okay, I can give them a chance.
The person who you can relate to in school. I'm the person who is also walking the road of success and I raise my hand up to you. Walking with me.
I get all the do a show like this with you tomorrow.
The change of the culture begins to form.
So now we're going to talk about needs, which is kind of like the hardest thing that we need to talk about. Whatever your needs are, I don't want you to shy away from it. Let us say no. Don't assume that we're going to say no.
For me, my number one goal is I want him to hear how each one of us are prepared to support him. And I want him to challenge us when he feels like he needs that support that we promised him.
I'm going to need you to be open, fearless, because this road to your success is going to be tough. And I will walk through the fire with you, but you got to come with me.
I'm going to be you that have the most confidence in the world. Nobody's going to know about what you're doing.
There's never been a situation where everybody in his school life was so concerned about her kids' well-being, and you're going to be the main focus of that circle. She's never been the main focus of nothing, probably.
Whenever you need to talk to somebody, and you need that confidence in someone, call anytime.
I never listened to my mom like that.
So to be a man who you want to follow. That's what I do. Sometimes if I ask you, I need some help. When you feel like I say, I need you, you look at me sometimes, give me a head nod. Don't talk to me. Talk to me. Because I don't know what's on your mind.
I was like, I do have to start talking to him more because I just go out and do whatever I want.
I do stuff like my father was supposed to do. Like I was peer pressure to do all the stuff I was doing. I just did it because my family needed it.
I pass anytime, being around you. I just want you to grow and understand who you are.
You might as well motivate. I know I can do that. You want to motivate.
got your back. And I need you to believe, and everybody in this room said they're here for you, that you trust it. And I need for you to fall back a little bit from that man role and taking the lead and just be a young man and enjoy this journey to being a man. And one thing that I know so much is that you love that woman right there so much. That's your heart right there. And you would drop on a dime for that your mother. Do you understand? And I know that you carry a heavy load sometimes because you worry about her. You worry about your family. I know that. I worry for you worrying about your family. And sometimes I think you're worrying about your family is the reason why you've made some of the decisions in your life that you've made. But those decisions in life need to change because you've got a network of people. And let some of us worry about that load, but you gotta tell us. You gotta tell us. And I need for mom to tell us too, because we want to help. We're not against you, we for you. I love your son, and out of loving your son, I love you. Because I know how much he loves you. And we're here for you. I'm going to be here for you. You hear me?
Mom used to smash on me about me coming in a little late. And I'd be like, I was helping to pay rent and all nine. So I really felt like I was the man in the house.
You're not considered on paper,
Yeah.
but you're greater than that. On so many levels, said, I am you. And I know there's some good things about me, but it took a long time for me to make those changes. And I had to accept people around me and accept the fact that they were offering to heal me. Because I was so closed-minded thinking I had to do it all myself. I need you to continue to be more open and more honest because it's all about your growth and development.
And when there's something getting in the way, tell us so we can help you and be there.
What I need from you is to keep coming back to the circle. Bring your successes to the circle to share with others, and bring your challenges back to the circle so we can support your needs.
You need to know how important you are. You're here to do something. I don't know what that is, but it's up to you to figure that out.
I need to break away from the script. I need to ask Mom, how can we support you? That's where it all comes from.
Is there to make everybody just support us, right?
Please. Mom is in need. Anybody knows any jobs? Because I know that's what be on his mind all the time.
Well, you know, I probably wouldn't be into this if you wasn't struggling. I just did it because my family needed it.
On-campus go-to person. That will be me. What supports are necessary for the student's success, and how will he receive it? What do you need help? Academically.
I need you to tutor and will be available.
We have other resources on there that's not in the school, and I'll introduce you to all those things. Who will monitor the plan? Trail's going to monitor the plan. Michelle's going to monitor the plan. KP going to monitor the plan. Mama's going to monitor the plan.
Have you had an internship yet?
I'm currently in an internship right now.
This is what your plan was. Let's come back in 30 days. We're going to look at the progress. Next time we meet, we're going to celebrate.
We're going to end this conference by showing Cedric and his mother some love. So everybody, you would just line up and just offer Cedric and his mother a hand and a smile, and we're just going to show him some love right now.
I never got along with teachers.
It's really heartwarming for me to sit on a collaborative.
It's time for us to stop being cowards and fix the mess that we
And ours dancing.
And our young people don't come to us adults because we don't come to what we say we're going to do. Today, I felt like these people in this room meant and said what they mean.
it certainly is real positive. You know, just look at it, but the fact you really say, I love this service. Thank you.
They cry, they laugh. Now we gotta keep our word.
So, this is justice, it's love correcting that which revolts against love. This, which is what Dr. King defined justice as, this is love. This is justice as love expressed in public spheres, Cornel West. This is a justice that does no harm to either party to a dispute, as Mahatma Gandhi said about justice. This is one of 3 types of circles that we use in the schools, communities, and in the justice system in Oakland today. We started our work in 2007 with a small pilot program in a middle school in West Oakland that was so successful in eliminating violence, reducing suspension rates by 87%, and completely eliminating teacher attrition rates, that it got the attention of the school district, this small program, this small pilot. And within a couple of years, the Oakland Unified School District adopted restorative justice as official school policy. So today, we have restorative justice programs in 30 schools in Oakland. So systems change is occurring. And for me, with my background of social justice activism, it's important that when we do this work that truly affects harm on interpersonal levels and on individual and micro levels, it's so important for me to have that, have a parallel track of systems change. And so that's a huge part of RJOA's strategy. And we're doing that now in the juvenile justice system as well. So this work is fundamentally about creating a village, for our youth. It's fundamentally about affirming the bonds of our inherent interrelatedness. It's fundamentally about creating these liberatory spaces in the schools, in the justice system, in the community. And we were talking about the 100th Monday, when enough of these circles are going, we reach critical mass, then it will become the norm. Just in that experiment with the scientists off islands in Japan, they saw monkeys rinsing their sweet potatoes in salt water. And after a certain number of monkeys were doing this on this particular island, they saw monkeys way on the other side of the ocean doing the same thing. It was almost as if there were a field of consciousness that somehow, after that critical mass was reached, spread. And so that's kind of the theory of change that we're operating on in Oakland. And restorative justice has gone from being in one school, a small middle school in 2007, to really spreading in a big way in Oakland, both on policy levels and on interpersonal levels. Let me tell you just a little bit about Cedric, and then I'm going to turn the podium over to these 2 young men. Cedric is doing well. He had been incarcerated for 18 months for a gun that went off in his classroom, accidentally. He had been carrying the gun because he was selling drugs to support his family. Because he mentioned, I think, the drugs in the video. Yeah. Cedric is doing great now with all of that support. You can see that in the circle, which was his first day at that school, which is a restorative justice school, where RJOA has a second pilot. You could see his body language, He was mumbling, he was bent over. And you saw him a year later, with an erect posture in the red and smiling and being very articulate. He is in college now, and he still has the job that he got as a result of that circle that took place, which was about 2 years ago. And this is the story of many youth. I mean, Oakland is a place where homicide by gun violence is the leading cause of death for all of our youth from age 1 to 24, 5 to 24. Yeah. Oakland is a place where if you talk to a youth like him or any of his classmates, girls and boys, they'll tell you that, at the age of 17, 14 of my friends have been killed due to gun violence. They've been to far more funerals than probably most of us in this room have been to, even those of us, the elders like me and Peter. So this kind of work is really making a difference in Cedric's life, obviously, and in the life of many other young men and women in Oakland. So, and one of the things I wanted to say is that restorative justice, I don't know how many of you know what restorative justice is, or how many of you have taken classes or done it. Can I ask how many of you have had trainings or read books about restorative justice? Okay, good, good. So just as a review, restorative justice is a worldview and a theory of justice that emphasizes bringing together everyone affected by harm to address needs and responsibilities and to heal the harm as much as possible. I won't go any more into the theory of restorative justice, but those are the main elements. Everyone, it's a communal, not an individual approach to justice. It involves everyone impacted, addresses needs and responsibilities, and it seeks to heal the harm as much as possible. Of course, this was not a conflict circle, but you should understand, if you don't already, you probably do, that restorative justice is a worldview. It's a way of being present to the world. It's a way of being present to the world to bring about wholeness and healing and compassion and empathy. It's a way of being. It's a worldview. It's not just something that comes into play once conflict has occurred to repair that. It is reparative, but it's also generative. It creates those spaces, those liberatory spaces that I was talking about earlier. And I think that that is, that's a part of the huge draw and attraction and allure of restorative justice to so many people. And before I finish, as a social justice activist, I often hear, well, restorative justice does great on harming interpersonal disputes. It works fine on the micro levels, but I mean, what is this business about restoring? We don't want to restore the status quo. We need to transform. And so a lot of people will sort of pit transformative justice against restorative justice. I think that's a false dichotomy, at least for me, as a person who has dedicated her life to racial and social justice activism. It's very much a part of my vision of restorative justice. And you can see, too, that restorative justice not only addresses harm on interpersonal levels, but through models like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, addresses structural harm, historical harm. And, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa is probably the most well-known example of that. But, you know, with Ferguson, with Trayvon, with Michael Jordan, with, you know, the constant repetition of the kinds of things that we saw, you know, in Ferguson just recently, I'm really wanting to write about and talk about doing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the pervasive human rights abuses against African American youth. Yeah. To deal with the root causes of why these kids are being murdered and killed. And also to begin to address the legacies of slavery. And of course our criminal justice system does not allow us to get to the roots. It does not allow us to create movements for social transformation. So that's my vision of how restorative justice can bring about social transformation. I know that's like a very, very tiny expression of that important point, but I really would like to allow you to hear the others. In closing, Charlene Spretnak, a cultural historian, has said that it is the massive denial of our inherent interrelatedness that has led to interspecies and intraspecies disaster. It is the massive denial of our inherent interrelatedness. And it took me a while to get to that. I thought it was racism for a while. I thought it was sexism. I thought it was capitalism, you know. I thought it was imperialism. And I've come to the point where I'm seeing that it's really the massive denial of our inherent interrelatedness. And so to the extent that we can become healers, because healers is about bringing wholeness. It comes from the same root word, healing, wholeness, and holiness. To the extent that we can create these villages, to the extent that we can affirm the bonds of our interrelatedness, then that's pretty subversive stuff that we're doing. Thank you.
Of that is wow. Thank you very much for that. Frankly, we could almost end there. There's a couple other things that I would like to say about restorative justice, as well as about some other work that we've been able to do in our legal clinic at the University of Wisconsin, as well as the things that were happening in Wisconsin and really the Midwest. Drawing together some of the themes that we've talked about today, and even sort of harkening back to last night, elements that are really important to understand about restorative justice is this idea of interconnectedness, that what one of us does affect all the rest of us. Again, you can see sort of the way things spread in restorative justice. It's really described as this sort of ripple effect, and obviously some of you are familiar with the concept of restorative justice. I won't go into that, but understanding that when we look at this idea of, as we touched on, idea of justice as love correcting that which revolts against love, what restorative justice is doing, or I think attempting to do in that situation or in that context, is really to break the cycle of passing on the pain. I really like to, again, so when I talk to students, some of the things that I like to get out of this, and we work with offenders and victim-offender dialogues and sensitive crimes and crimes of severe violence, is first looking at and recognizing the fundamental humanity, or as Peter said earlier, sort of seeing the common humanity. And that's really looking at, again, I think this sort of this oneness, that we live in relation, that all of us sort of exist in social relationships, and we really desire to exist in that fashion. And harm is relational, crime is relational. And so when we look at, again, whether it's a harmful act or a criminal act, the way that that sort of spreads out, it affects more than just the direct people involved. It's, as Doug talked about, you're representing families, that everything that happens draws in so many more people. And restorative justice really gets at this broader perspective and really this broader vision of that, and really pulls a lot of that in. And I'll say the same thing about the process for change. So when, again, the idea of the discussion, or the things that I was thinking about this panel as restorative justice as a vehicle for social change, the process of change, too, is relational. It often happens sort of one group at a time, and individual to individual, and I really hope that's some of what happens here today, and that we go from here sort of energized, and we're able to bring a lot of that desire and a lot of that hope forward from here. I'll share just again sort of a couple stories that illustrated some of the impact. So again, this is it's about people, it's about relationships. And also it's really about hope. And when we look at the victim offender dialogues that we've done, just a couple examples of some of the things that have come out there. I can look back even just sort of several weeks and look at the impact or how this affects people's lives and drives change. I was sitting in a garage on folding chairs with two students talking with a mother who, after again sort of working with her and addressing what had happened in her situation, she really said that, and to the student, that you saved my life. And really, again, through this listening, through interacting and connecting in a way that no one else had done, that the criminal justice system did not do, that people before did not do, and after had not yet done. And something that she had said, and this was, again, weird, but she said, when you sent your brochure, she's like, there's your picture, and she's like, I cut your picture out and I put it on my wall of fame. And I would say, well, usually if you cut a picture out of a lawyer and you hang it on something, it's probably going to be darts thrown at it. So She said, who else out there is her daughter's oncologist, and again, we think what we do is sort of very simple, and I think again in this work, it can be so meaningful because you never know the impact that you're going to have. And I'll get into when we talk about sort of social change and the different arenas that happens in, why that's important. One other comment from a survivor who had gone through a dialogue last year had really described as being dead for 18 years. And until she was able to go through this dialogue process, she never recognized or even realized sort of grass growing, didn't realize flowers blooming in the spring. And it wasn't until after she had gone through this sort of restorative process that she started to recognize those things again and sort of return to life. And so part of that is a long way of also saying why I really, really love what I do, and why I feel so blessed to be able to work in this field, and having been able to work in the public schools, and certainly now working in the law school setting to train future lawyers and hopefully help influence the type of practitioners that are leaving our schools to go into district attorney's offices, to go into public defender offices, to go into civil law, to go into all those fields, that we can look at things in a little bit different way. And that's really where I think we're bringing in sort of the vision, or the greater vision, both of Dr. King's work, but also some of the mission of PISA, that we are trying to create more thoughtful, more humanistic, and holistic practitioners. We had a referral last year for a case that could have gone through the traditional justice system, and they had come to approach our program and said, could you develop something that we don't feel that going through the traditional system is going to satisfy our interests. Certainly, yes, someone could go to prison, but that's not going to make any of us, any of the victims of this crime, feel any better, nor was it going to make the community any better. And so we developed, or were able to develop a process, and one of the responses that we got from that was, this was authentic justice. And that was a phrase to me that certainly stood out, because what it was said that we were doing was something real and something different. And that, again, transformed sort of a small community, and we watched sort of the discussions of this. We're watching this movement spread across the country and frankly, across the world. And some of the ways in Wisconsin that it is sort of spread, there's been some incredible leaders. Again, David Lerman was particularly one in Milwaukee to bring it to the district attorney's office, and Justice Janine Geske, who is internationally known and heralded, has done so much for that community and for that work. And sort of the three pillars that I guess sort of that Marquette model was based on sort of using that at Wisconsin, is that we're involved in prisons, in schools, and in the community. And to back up how that really developed is, so there had been a prison program at the Green Bay Correctional Facility, and Justice Geske had been there doing a restorative justice program for almost, really 2 decades. And what they were seeing is, again, you see these men's lives transform over this 3-day or 4-day program. And what we started to hear is that these men were saying, thanking us so much for coming, and thanking her for all the work that she was doing with them, and for the community coming in. And that was the other thing about that program, is that it invites in the community to take part in that. So it's, again, business leaders and other people from the community to see what it's like in prison, and to realize that these people, again, many of them are coming back home, and to let them know that we want them back and that we are supporting them. And again, that sort of changes a group at a time. And what the men were saying that were going through this program was saying, we really appreciate everything that you're doing here, but really you should be in the schools. You shouldn't be here talking to us. You should be out talking to me 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And that sort of spurred some more of the action initiative to move down into the public schools. And so that expanded the work there, because they would say, look, had I known this, had I known then what I know now, or experienced this, I probably wouldn't be here. And so that's sort of the work there. And again, that was seen expanded partially with, again, by David Lerman and his development of the community counseling program at the district attorney's office in Milwaukee. as part of a diversion or deferred prosecution agreements, that people could go through a restorative process rather than just strictly the traditional criminal justice process. Another thing that then Milwaukee did is the DA's office ended up taking David. He petitioned for this and was placed directly in the public schools, and his full-time job was doing circles in schools, because sort of the DA's office and the criminal system sort of saw what was happening. And this is, again, this whole idea of combating this school-to-prison pipeline. And after David left the schools, they placed another district attorney there, and he was there for, I think, 4 to 5 years. And so it had a really big impact on both the way that the system worked there, as well as how we were viewing conflict, how we were viewing how, again, children developed and how they ended up how they ended up where they were at 15 years later, potentially, whether that was in a correctional facility or successful in society. And so when I moved to Madison, and I started looking around what was going there, and saw there were some things going on in the schools, and I've been at the law school now for essentially just over a year. And so in addition to the offender dialogues, we're starting to get involved in the Madison public schools. And as part of their new behavioral education plan, they're eliminating their zero tolerance policy, and have incorporated a great deal of restorative practices into this new plan. And I have sort of statements from one of the individuals there talking about this issue because of sort of the racial disparities issue. And that's what's really been driving much of the change in Dane County and in Madison. There's a race to equity report. I think Madison, again, views itself as sort of a liberal bastion or haven of progressiveness in the state of Wisconsin. But when they started to look at some of the numbers and data, they found that some of the greatest racial disparity actually was present there. And so I'm going to read just a little bit of what this person said about the change in schools. So it says, Madison, as in many other places, there has been a significant disparity in educational and discipline outcomes for students based on race. We haven't fully understood or honored the role race plays in our own lives, the lives of our students, and in our interactions. And sort of as a result of that, they were oftentimes, you were finding disparities in results in punishment. They were disproportionately involved in disciplinary proceedings, and this was having very, very negative outcomes. So what they're looking to do is, so in taking a very different approach, and as she describes, an approach that focuses on teaching and learning and support rather than on punishment, and coupling that with the recognition of race and ethnicity, and teaching that is culturally responsive, we want to transform the relationships with kids and their educational and social outcomes. And restorative practices has the potential to very specifically and directly promote the healing and transformation and lead us to different outcomes both within the school and the wider community. And that really captures, again, this idea of restorative justice as a vehicle for social change. Oftentimes that starts in the schools. Where we're moving is, again, in this response to the racial disparity, is launching a restorative court in a neighborhood in Dane County that will look to offer an alternative to the traditional criminal justice system for misdemeanor offenders between the ages 17 and 25. And what we're hoping is that this sort of pilot project will take off, and we will find a reduction in the sort of racial disparities that we were seeing in Dane County. So I know we're sort of moving along on time, so I will pause there. We'll open it up for questions after a while, so we can go into anything else that we might want to talk about, but I'll turn it over to Andy for now.
Thanks, Jonathan. So my name is Andy Arts, and my area of expertise is school discipline. And most of my practice in school discipline is taking place here in New York City, working with Nanette, who I was very lucky to have for my first 4 years of legal practice as my supervisor. And I want to talk today about the challenges that I experienced working in school discipline in New York City and trying to incorporate something beyond suspension into the discipline process, and particularly mediation and restorative justice. So when I was in law school at NYU, one of my most powerful experiences was helping to found the Suspension Representation Project, which is a group of law students that represents families in long-term superintendent suspension hearings in New York City. And New York City is such a large district, more than 1 million students, more than 1,700 schools, that there is a whole system of administrative hearings that is set up to handle the many long-term suspensions that happen every year. And so there are 5 suspension hearing offices that each employ 4 or more hearing officers whose full-time job it is to hear long-term suspension cases of students in New York City. And when I started doing this work as a law student in 2006, there were more than 16,000 of these long-term superintendent suspensions every year. So it was very powerful for me as a law student to help try and address the need for representation that these families had in these hearings that have suspensions that can last anywhere from 6 days to 1 year. And there's no right to representation, meaning that almost all families that go into these hearings are unrepresented. And so to have law students step into that role was something that we felt could be very beneficial to the families that were facing these hearings. And at the same time as that this was a very powerful experience for me, I also was realizing the limited extent to which I could help these families as a law student. We were trained how to advocate at hearings and to do our best in helping to fight the charges and help argue for mitigating circumstances that would help reduce these suspensions from the maximum that the school might be requesting to something that we thought was much more reasonable. And we would incorporate arguments about the student's special education needs that may not have been addressed, or the underlying bullying that the student may have been experiencing, or the conflict that the teacher and the student had that had led to this issue. But I continually felt during those representations as a law student that I wasn't really getting to the cause of the issue, and that the student, after leaving the hearing, was not in the position that they needed to be successful in school. And I applied to be a fellow with Legal Services in the Bronx, with Nanette, in part because I felt like as an attorney doing these hearings and doing this work, I would have a better opportunity to create positive change for my clients in these hearings beyond what I could do as a law student. And I absolutely found that to be true. And in particular, I found the relationship between special education and school discipline to be one that needed a lot of attention from those of us doing this work, both in my office in the Bronx and throughout the city and the country, surely. And so helping to push for behavior intervention plans, helping to push for manifestation determination reviews, which prevent a school from pushing for a long suspension and make sure that that student gets back to the program that's most appropriate for them, was something that I incorporated in my practice. But I was still left with the feeling on a regular basis that the suspension hearing was not doing anything either to address the problem that had led to the incident, and that it was just being a negative influence in the student and the family's life in general. And I was talking with some people earlier about how antagonistic those hearings were, and how in most cases this student was going to be returning to the school that was suspending him or her, and the school was doing everything it could at this hearing to bring out everything that was awful about the student, bring up all of their previous disciplinary incidents, talk about all of present the incident in the worst possible light for the student, because that's what they were looking for. They were looking for a decision from the hearing officer to suspend the student and to go along with the school's recommendation for what that suspension should be. And meanwhile, the family and the student are sitting there listening to this disparagement of the student, and the students felt, I can't believe they said that about me, they're lying, that's not the whole truth, that's not what was coming out of this. And even when we had an opportunity to present our side of the story through our own witnesses or our own evidence, if we chose to put that forth, the family was left in a position where they didn't want the student to be in that school anymore. And we constantly were requesting transfers for the student. That's what the parents said to me, I want my kid out of this school. But that was not always available, and to the extent that we could, we would try to work with the school after the hearing to get beyond what had just happened, and to talk about, even if the student was not a student with a behavior intervention plan, where can this student go? What kind of support is available to the student in your school so that when they come back, this won't happen again? And those were sometimes helpful conversations and sometimes not. But I just found that I was seeing a lot of the same clients over and over. They were being suspended again upon returning to school. And I was aware, of course, of the school-to-prison pipeline and the racial disparities that exist in terms of disproportionality of suspensions in New York City. And I was aware of the overall numbers, where in addition to those 16,000 or more superintendent suspensions, there were also 75,000, 73,000 total suspensions, meaning another 50,000, 45,000 principal suspensions, which were being handed down to students in New York City schools, which principal suspensions meaning 1 to 5 days and no automatic right to a hearing. And I was often left with the feeling that there needed to be another way. And this is what we've been talking about all day today. And I felt that something like restorative justice or something like mediation, either in addition to or a better choice, in lieu of a suspension, was really necessary. And I started working with a group called the Dignity in Schools Campaign New York, which is a coalition of young people, mostly high school students, and teachers and advocates like me and community organizers who wanted to change the disciplinary system in New York City and move it away from this culture of discipline to a culture of acceptance, of cooperation, of conflict resolution. And we started meeting on a regular basis with the Office of Safety and Youth Development, which is the body in the New York City Department of Education that's responsible for the discipline code and the disciplinary system in general. And when we first started meeting with them, we found them to be really uninformed about what was happening in their own schools, and to be very also uninformed about what alternatives exist beyond suspension and other types of punitive discipline. And that was disheartening. And there was, I guess, a feeling within part of the coalition that these meetings were not worth it, and that we should abandon them in favor of a different strategy. Just because we didn't see there being any possibility that the Department of Education would change their minds. And so that's one of the challenges that I experienced doing this work. Number one was getting the Department of Education to buy into this being a worthwhile endeavor in the first place. But another challenge, and I see these challenges as analogous to our challenge as a group to incorporate these principles into legal work in general. I think trying to get restorative justice incorporated into the New York City discipline system is analogous. And another challenge that we ran into was that our own community didn't buy into this. And when we would talk to young people who were coming to the coalition for the first time, they said, I want kids suspended. I don't want mediation. I don't want them to be right back after getting in a fight. I want them out. And that was a theme that we hear from parents, from students, from community members, from teachers, not exclusively, of course, but hearing over and over, we need to get the bad kids out of here. And I was struck earlier about how that was such expression of seeing people as the other, and not thinking about the interconnectedness and the relationships that we really need to have and recognizing each other to be worthwhile. And as we continue to meet with the Office of Safety and Youth Development, they slowly began to start to be more open to our suggestions. And part of this had to do with the other sort of grassroots work that we were doing. We were getting elected officials involved. We were testifying at city council hearings. And there have been changes now after 3 or 4 years of this kind of advocacy to the Department of Education. Now, the number of suspensions has been reduced by a significant number, from a high of about 73,000 2 years ago to 53,000 at the most recent figure, which is still a real problem. And I don't think anybody thinks that 53,000 suspensions is an appropriate number. And one pervasive difficulty is that even with a reduction in suspensions, we're seeing no reduction in terms of the disproportionality of suspensions that are imposed for black students or for students with special needs. But it's a step. Reduction in suspensions is good. And the Department of Education has incorporated restorative practices into its discipline code in that it's available to school administrators that want to use it. It's not required, but if your school wants to try this, then you can try it. And they have consistently pushed back against the idea that it should be mandatory and that that all schools need to incorporate it into their disciplinary practice. But it's growing, and I've heard that they have plans this school year to have at least 50 schools who are trained in restorative justice, which is still just a drop in the bucket since there are still more than 1,700 schools in the city. But 50 schools is great, and the hope is that those pilot schools demonstrate the same example that Fania was talking about with the middle school in Oakland, and that this catches on. And I hear from some of the staff members who are doing this work in their schools that there are still problems, meaning that the Department of Education does not provide any sort of ability for these schools to connect and support each other in a way that could be really valuable to them. That it's organizations like the United Federation of Teachers, and specifically a group called Teachers Unite, which is also promoting this work, that know a lot more and are able to support these schools on a stronger level in the Department of Education, which is something that needs to change. And they still hear from other teachers that there's a feeling with this work that there are absolutely no consequences for the student, which of course is absolutely untrue. And one of the purposes of circles and fairness committees and addressing incidents of discipline is that everybody involved gets to have a say in what those consequences are and have ownership of those consequences beyond just somebody imposing a suspension. But at the same time, those administrators that I've recently spoke with feel like in general, the Department of Education is willing to try something that hasn't been tried before, and that they are starting to get pushback from the Department of Education when they are requesting these suspensions, which is something that's happening for the first time. And that more and more schools in New York City are seeking restorative justice coordinators for their schools. So there are steps, and I think the message that I wanted to sort of end with was about pressure points. And Nanette, when she spoke this morning, talked about litigation being one possible pressure point as a way to encourage the community or the legal system or an agency to take action or make policy changes which incorporate the kinds of practices that we're here to talk about into their work or into the fabric of what they do. And I would say that another really important pressure point for us to keep in mind is community organizing, which is something that I personally find very difficult and which I don't think is one of my strengths. But I think it's going to be really important to, as other people have said today, to have those conversations where we're exposing other people to these ideas and challenging their responses about getting the bad kids out, or that this means that there aren't really any consequences, or that our school district is too big to be able to bring these changes about in every school. So I'm looking forward to continue to work with you. I've really been inspired today by my first PISLAP conference, and I haven't spoken about my current role at the Department of Education in the Office for Civil Rights, meaning the federal government. But I'm really looking forward to bringing some of these principles back to my work in that role as well. Thanks.
Shall we open it up to some questions and dialogue? We have a little time. I'll maybe just kick it off. Just to thank you all. That was wonderful, and I was just reflecting a little on Andy's point about community organizing and remembering an occasion when the New York City has a yearly hearing for the school discipline code, and there's an ongoing effort, as Andy was talking about, in trying to introduce restorative practices and mediation into the discipline code and reduce the zero tolerance policy. And I remember a lot of young people getting up at this hearing and speaking about what it felt like to be searched when they walked into their school, to be marginalized, to be suspended, to be perhaps judged harshly when their side of the story hadn't been heard, and to feel almost like strangers in their own school, to feel that the people whom they entrusted themselves to work with, their teachers and their leaders, were not able to hear them and connect with them. And I thought it was very powerful, and I'm wondering what all of your thoughts are about bringing that more feeling dimension into the advocacy work of creating restorative justice alternative, of that kind of emotional, psycho-emotional dimension of really hearing what the experience is for young people and their parents.
The question is, what are our experiences in bringing psycho?
Well, I guess what, in your experience, what role does that aspect of the advocacy work of bringing restorative justice into the schools play in terms of, really living into the experiences of the students and their alienation and distance from the people whom they trust, which your video really was the antithesis of that. The teacher, the principal hugging and supporting Cedric. I mean, that was the exact opposite.
Yeah. I suppose, well, in our case, there wasn't a big movement. I don't know why, but we didn't have to launch a community grassroots movement to affect a policy change in the school district, or even the juvenile justice work that we're doing either. But the psycho-emotional or psycho-spiritual element is really, really important. For example, bless you, we will do trainings with principals and vice principals, especially. And usually when we do 2 or 3 day trainings, they'll come in only for 2 or 3 hours, and we excuse them because we know that they've got all kinds of things to navigate. But even when they know the statistics, if a child is suspended, their chances of being incarcerated triples, incarcerated within 1 year. If they're suspended once, their chances of being pushed out or dropping out doubles. And if you look, in institutions, incarceral institutions, 75% of inmates are high school dropouts. So this work that we're doing to keep kids in school is just really huge in terms of interrupting strategies of mass incarceration. And I just want to say thank you guys for addressing the racial disparity issue. I normally always talk about that because in the restorative justice movement, there's not a very we're not very skilled in the restorative justice movement in general and historically for the 40 years of its existence on race issues. And I'm usually always privileging that issue, always talking about it. I didn't mention it once, but I just want to acknowledge you guys for making that a really central part of your presentation, so thank you. Yeah. But that was a little detour, and I think an important one, but when it comes to principals and training them, they'll get the statistics. They'll get it cognitively. Oh yeah, we love this program. Bring it to our school, and train our teachers. But when the rubber meets the road, when there's been a big fight at school, they're going to go back to their sort of knee-jerk response of suspending. There's got to be consequences. I got parents. I've got the community pressuring me. So I'm sorry. We will not do restorative justice. So that has happened, and we find that will happen until a principal, or if it's a teacher or vice principal, actually has an experience of what restorative justice is about, actually has an experience in circle. I mean, you saw how moving that experience was. Until they had that kind of experience, they don't embody it. They have it here, but when the crisis comes, they're going to go back to the old ways of doing things. So the psycho-emotional experience that they have when they're sitting in a well-facilitated circle is really critical to help them make that shift from a paradigm of zero tolerance and a punitive response to a paradigm of a restorative response.
Thank you all, each, together, separately. Appreciating the harmony of your presentations, and I have a few questions. One is just, I was struck by a number of aspects of your different presentations. One is just a statement that you made, Fania, that you see restorative justice as a way of life. And I hadn't ever really thought of it that way, but I have had an experience that I've been trying to figure out where to place it, which was several years ago. I sat on a regular monthly basis with a group that was meeting in San Francisco. You may or may not be familiar with them, but it's called Healing Circles. And it was formed by George Sharand, who was a person who worked in the Sheriff's Department in San Francisco, African-American male, who formed this group to support families in San Francisco who had experienced the death of a child almost exclusively as a victim of black-on-black crime, or a child or family member. And so these were people who were meeting. They were calling it a healing circle. And I was trying to figure out how, if any, in what way it might be seen through the lens of restorative justice, because they were meeting amongst themselves. It wasn't victim offender, but to see this example that you presented of kind of bringing that individual person back in and supporting them. This was where the community was supporting each other and healing, like a therapy group, but it had a political dimension. People were starting as a consequence to form policy prescriptives. Like, they were hearing from each other how deeply the community was being impacted by not only the original victimization, but then the follow-on criminal process. And so they were organizing to go to Sacramento, and they ultimately rented a bus and went to Sacramento and testified against some of the tough on crime policies. So it was a very interesting, I've never been able to figure out where to place this as an example of something like a community-based response to their own victimization with a kind of a restorative justice component, but not in the traditional, not traditionally as I think of it. So I'm wondering if you guys have any reflection on that as an example of something like, would it fall within the scope of restorative justice in your view?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, many people think of restorative justice as a modality that comes into play after conflict has occurred. And many people reduce it to a conflict resolution process. We find, however, that we do more community building, trust building, relationship building, healing circles, value circles in the classroom than those circles that respond to conflict. And in fact, we when we train our restorative justice coordinators, we suggest that they do 70% more of those kinds of proactive circles that create a culture of connectivity, that affirm the bonds of their interrelatedness. We know that if a student feels a strong sense of connectivity, of belonging in a school setting, that is very strongly predictive of positive social and academic outcomes. So we spent a lot of time creating that sense of belonging, using the circle process that you used with George Durand, as well as doing the other, conflict circles where you have the traditional encounter between the person harmed and the person causing harm. So that's an important point. And so we're doing
proactive.
It's a proactive. So we also have that triple. I don't know which one you talked about, the triple. I think it was you. They talked about the triple focus of your work: schools, communities, and justice system. So we're doing a lot of those. We're doing circles of support and accountability in communities for youth returning from a period of incarceration. And most of those look kind of like the one that you saw. Now, we will want to have at least one or two circles where we bring the person harmed to have an encounter with that re-entering youth. And if the actual person harmed doesn't come, then at least a surrogate.
And that is the format I more often hear about, that victim offender.
That's what most people think of when they think of restorative justice. And those kind of unlikely alliances that are formed after, the sort of miraculous things that happen where the survivor of say, a woman's child has been murdered, and the mother and the daughter of the deceased meet with the killer, right, after a very careful period of preparation, maybe going for a period of 1 or 2 years. And then to see what happens in those circles and how they end up embracing and making friends for life, it's just, that's what a lot of us know about. And those are some really amazing and miraculous singing experiences. But we see them a lot, like you saw this youth who never trusted teachers, this mother who's only called to school when her kid gets into trouble. This was just a profound experience for them.
Wow.
So I would certainly characterize that as community building and a community building circle as a restorative practice. Oftentimes what I will say is that you cannot resolve conflict until you build community. So when I talk about students who are going to be going into schools to work there, we'll say, well, what are we going to do first, or what are we going to do? Are we only going to be doing conflict or the sort of conflict resolution? I said, no. Likely you're not going to get to that for a while because the trust won't be there. And so the whole sort of first, could be 6 weeks that you're there, may be exclusively community building before you have gotten to that level of trust where you can actually start dealing with conflict. And that's, so I consider it, that as a restorative practice, but it can be used in many, many different contexts. And if you want to look again sort of at the reentry context, that's something that one of the things that we are doing is there's a transitional living facility. So women who are returning from prison, we've started sort of an 8-week program at this house, this transitional living facility that looks at all the restorative elements. But it's also about reintegration into the community and really community building. That also, again, at some point we do bring in a survivor of crime, but that happens later.
Yeah.
We first have to build community before we can get there.
And when I hear you guys describe this, I can really see restorative justice as transformative justice. That line between them is much less firm than before in my mind.
Yeah.
So the only other question I had is, of course, I would ask about contemplative practice. I see restorative justice almost as a form of, I can imagine that within the framework of a practice, a contemplative sort of practice. But I'm curious if you all envision a role, a particular personal role or group role for specific kinds of contemplative practices within the circle, meditation, pausing, any of that, or if you want to speak to any ways in which those practices support you in your own personal development as practitioners of this. I'm just curious if you see any synergies between these.
Yeah, centering exercise is often used certainly before you begin a circle. Again, if that's how you're going to be starting anything, it generally helps. I tell any facilitator, before you can go into a situation when you might not know exactly what you're walking into, if you aren't centered in yourself, you're not going to be fully present. So those are things that I do think are very important, are sort of centering exercises. I've certainly seen them start with moments of silence, with again, a small mindfulness moment or some meditation. I've even seen guided meditation to start them. So it does use those elements. Again, that's going to depend on sort of, I think, both the setting and the facilitator, but they definitely have a place.
Yeah, and we like to say that restorative justice is holistic. It addresses the needs of body, mind, spirit, and emotion. And in fact, I think Robert Yazzie, who's the Chief Justice of the Navajo Peacemaking Court, has said that the most important piece of paper in his court, in the peacemaking court, and in restorative justice, is a Kleenex. So that's the emotion. Of course, that's not allowed in our Western traditional setting, but we'll do stuff for the body, because you get a sense people are feeling restless. Well, we need to get up and do some stretching or some meditation like we did earlier, a movement meditation. And depending on who we are with in the circle, maybe the circle participants want to start off with a prayer, a Christian prayer. That is what they do. or sometimes would save, but you know, you have to be very careful about those things because you want to come up with something that is consistent with the needs and preferences of everyone. But that, yeah, taking care of spirit, mind, body, and emotions is always, you know, important in the circle process.
There's a question there,
Thank
and
you.
I think also back there.
I have a few kind of questions / comments.
Oh, thank you.
A couple of questions and comments. The first is just a small one. Fania, you mentioned you used the term well facilitated, and I was thinking, like, what a difficult job that can be. Like in the film that you showed, the facilitator was brilliant. He knew when to say something and when to not say something. I mean, it was so intuitive. You got the feeling like he was able to do this since he was 3 years old, and which may not be the case, but it felt that he's so excellent at it, and I don't think that's necessarily easy. I mean, I don't know how many great facilitators there are, but it's something we can all aspire to in using various types of processes. But I think it does take a lot of training, and you know, you hear about a lot of mediation training, but you don't hear about too much facilitative type of training, and for these processes that seems very important. I secondly wanted to mention, Alex, you had mentioned the term mediation several times, but focused on restorative justice, and I would just love to hear a couple of quick examples of how you see mediation processes being used in the same context. So it's like contextually the same, but the process is different. And finally, I just wanted to say, in the 90s, we started a program on human rights mediation for the city of New York. Actually, Mayor Jenkins started the program, and I was the person who created the program. And what we found in human rights mediation was similar to some of the things that you've been talking about, and it's really been bringing it back to me as you've been talking, because you would have people accused of, you know, just heinous ways of treating other people, of awful ways of trying to take the dignity out from under other people. And then through really good mediative processes, you could sort of start seeing it being put back, and you'd have some situations where people who really hated each other. I mean, we also had threats on our lives and people who brought guns to the processes and everything else. And I would often see these very same people at the end inviting each other to dinner, hugging, crying, the Kleenexes were everywhere. And you feel like, my God, it seems sort of magical and miraculous, but I guess it's just that the process can be so effective. So, you know, in our experience doing human rights mediation for the city, it was effective for adults as well as the description you have about how effective it is in terms of students.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I mentioned mediation in part because it was one of the types of initiatives that you know, I personally and also the Dignity in Schools campaign supported as something a school might adopt short of restorative justice, for example. I mean, we've talked about restorative justice at its most effective being something holistic, being something really inside the culture of the school or the community. And I think of mediation as something that doesn't necessarily go that far, something that may be more reactive, and therefore something that may be cheaper or easier for a school to implement, not necessarily as effective as restorative justice. But there are programs in the city that are using peer mediation to great effect, and some of them are profiled in the Safety with Dignity document that was part of the materials for this, and I think are available in the back here. I was leading an effort to try and incorporate mediation directly into the suspension hearing process. So rather than having schools, rather than wait for schools to, come around to using alternatives to suspension before the student actually got to the suspension hearing, I was hoping to encourage the district citywide and starting in the Bronx to use mediation actually at the suspension hearing office as a way to address those root causes that I saw continually not being addressed. And one example that I remember that was very vivid, I had a 6th grade client named Miguel who was facing a 60-day suspension for breaking another student's leg. And what had happened was the student, they got in an altercation, and my client, the other student kicked his leg out of my client who grabbed the other student's leg, and the other student fell and in the process broke his leg. And so the school was pushing for a very long suspension for the student because of the injury. And when Miguel met with me, he described how this other student had been bullying him for a long time, and that the other student was saying that he was gay, and really some very serious bias-based harassment that was happening. And on the day of this incident, the other student was pursuing him outside after school. And my client, finally felt like he had to engage with the student and didn't intend to get into a fight. And it just ended up, with a consequence that was very serious for the other student. And, we could bring some of those facts out at the suspension hearing, but I just saw a need for something to address what's really going on here. And my client, Miguel, was not disputing that he was involved in this or that, something bad happened, because it did. But to have something there at the hearing office that would have been available to those students to try and get to what was the underlying cause, I felt would have been really valuable. And we were trying to take advantage of a resource in the Bronx where there was, a center for mediation and conflict resolution that was willing to use their staff members or make available their staff members in these hearings. And that was another thing that the Department of Education was not yet willing to even try. But I know there are other organizations and other advocates that are still pushing for that, and it's something I hope that comes to fruition.
And there is also, restorative mediation is also a movement. So you might see it in personal injury, medical malpractice are two areas. So Colorado, if you're interested, look in Colorado. It's happening there. And actually, recently there was an assembly bill in Wisconsin, an apology bill that would allow physicians to apologize without that being sort of held against them in litigation. So I think we might be moving more in that direction to sort of try and get away from sort of this mediation that's actually a little more than sort of shuttle negotiation. So there's part of that movement as well. It's a sort of a modality in the field of mediation. Yeah.
This question is for Fania. I'm wondering if you could describe how you envision the truth and reconciliation process playing out in a place like Ferguson, which would involve such a large-scale engagement of restorative justice.
That's a really good question. I can tell you what other truth and reconciliation processes have looked like, and then we can probably infer from those processes what Ferguson Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or actually this would probably be, first of all, I would see it as a national truth and reconciliation, not just focused on Ferguson. As in South Africa, I would see it as something that is going to get a lot of media, unbiased, objective, media coverage. Like in South Africa during the Truth and Reconciliation, everybody were tuned to their radio at 5 o'clock every evening, in the shops, in the townships, people were very engaged. So that level, some sort of communication strategy that would allow that level of involvement. And students talking about it in schools, for one. And typically what happens is that persons who have been harmed in the way that Trayvon Martin, in the way that Michael Jordan, Michael Brown was harmed, would come forward, their survivors, family survivors would come forward and testify about that. Possibly persons causing that harm in the past could also come and testify and take responsibility. We wouldn't want to have someone come and testify who's not going to take responsibility. So a lot of unearthing of other cases. There's so many other cases. We probably want to take the opportunity to investigate and unearth buried histories of this sort of thing that we don't know about, to just get a sense of the pervasiveness, the scope of the problem. Then we probably want to have some people testify about how this is a legacy, a direct legacy of slavery, you know? People like Joy Degree and others who could make that connection in a really powerful and cogent way. So that would be the hearing part. And then we come to the part about, you know, well, what do we do? What do we do? The idea is that we can have memorialization initiatives. There should be statues and memorials in the various places across the country where youth have lost their lives. And as I'm saying this, you know what, I'm thinking about the black on black crime too. I wouldn't want to, you know, overlook that issue, because the fact of the matter is that more of our black youth are being killed by one another. But, you know, some expert testimony about how this is an expression of internalized racism, right? And how that goes back to slavery, you know. And then we want to, when we come to talking about what we do, reparations, you know. In South Africa, this was the whole process that was followed. A lot of people criticized the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission because it was great on the hearing part, great on the psychosocial sphere. People were having a, you know, were embracing the old proponents of apartheid, and those who were harmed severely really did come together, and there was a great reconciliation. And there was a lot of truth happening, but fell short on the reparations issue. Yeah. The redistribution of wealth, and that sort of thing. So there would have to be a whole section on what we do about it, what kind of reparations. And those reparations could be financial, they could be the memorials that I talked about. Also, probably on another level of what we do is curricula training of public officials, training of police officers, restorative justice training of police officers. We're in police and youth healing circles. We're actually doing that in Oakland. We're training police officers in restorative justice. We have had police youth healing circles, which have been just really, really amazing. When I get back, we're going to be training 40 probation officers to deal with youth. So those kinds of things can be recommended across the country.
Better representation of communities on the police forces that are serving those
Exactly,
communities.
all of those. So basically, it would be an opportunity to have a national conversation that is respectfully and widely publicized, that engages the entire population. An educational experience, they will learn about slavery and how that, you know, how that has led directly to the killings that we see today, both within the community and between police and youth.
When do you start?
Exactly.
Today. No. When do we start this? I want to really write an article about it, so if anybody wants to write it with me, let me know. Yeah. And I want to do that soon. And there's a really great article did anyone see it in the Huffington Post, by Sheila Betty, who's an attorney at Northwestern Law, who sets the stage. She basically talks in her article about how criminal prosecutions aren't going to change anything at all. The killings will continue because they don't address the root causes, the historical causes. So she really lays the stage for, you know, us to write an article about, well, here's what will, you know, address root causes. Here's what can bring about systemic change and prevent these kinds of things from happening.